Hi everyone. With this mind map session, I wanted to specifically focus on the structures of the respiratory system as well as some basic functions of those structures from the lecture and the lab material. So I have here the lab list for the respiratory anatomy, and in red I've highlighted some of the basic functions of those structures as well as some descriptions as well. So we'll go through this list beginning with the external structures of the respiratory system, because there are really only a few structures that belong to the external respiratory system, and everything else is internalized. The first structure we'll examine here on this list are the external nares, and this is the term for the external nostril opening, that is the initial passageway that's allowing air into and out of the respiratory system through the by way of the nasal cavity. So, of course, we can breathe through the mouth, but the mouth is also used by the digestive system as well. So, for that reason, or for that purpose, the nose and the nasal cavity are strictly respiratory system structures, whereas the mouth can serve as a respiratory system structure, but it also shares functions with the digestive system as well. Internal to those nares are called the nasal vestibules, and these are small chambers that are usually lined with very coarse, thick hairs, as well as mucus-producing structures and glands, so that collectively the mucus produced by those glands, as well as the hairs, function to trap and filter out any dust, dirt, or debris that is attempting to enter the respiratory system, the nasal cavity, through the external nares. The nasal septum is a structure that physically divides the nasal cavity into right and left halves, and the nasal septum is mostly made of cartilage, and it's inside of the nose. It's lined with an epithelial tissue, the same epithelial tissue that makes up the majority of the epithelial tissue that we find in the nasal cavity. The posterior nasal aperture serves as a passageway from the posterior part of the nasal cavity into a chamber that's called the nasopharynx, and the nasopharynx is the initial region of the pharynx, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Within the nasal cavity are the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, and these are essentially structures that increase the surface area inside of the nasal cavity. And the increase in surface area in the nasal cavity kind of serves two purposes. It helps to make the flow of air in through the nasal cavity more turbulent, and the reason why we want that air to be more turbulent is so that any odors can have time to be detected by the sensory structures that are within the nasal cavity. And it also buys time for that air to be warmed and humidified, because air that's incoming to the respiratory system has to be properly warmed and humidified by the time it reaches the lungs, so that the membranes that are performing gas exchange at the deep within the lungs are not dried out. And humidifying and warming the air helps to prevent those membranes that are within the lungs from drying out, and helping to facilitate better gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the blood that is picking up the oxygen that's being inhaled into the lungs and exchanging carbon dioxide across the blood and into the airs to eliminate, or in the air in the lungs to eliminate that carbon dioxide. So we want that air to be warmed and humidified by the time it gets to the gas exchange membranes within the lungs, and the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae are just one set of structures that help to accomplish that. Another set of structures that help to warm and humidify incoming air are the paranasal sinuses, and these are simply chambers that are within cranial and facial bones that are adjacent to the nasal cavity. So hence the name paranasal sinuses. The term paranasal means they're adjacent to the nasal cavity. But they also act as resonance chambers for producing speech sounds as well. So not only do they serve a function of humidifying incoming air, but they also serve a speech function as well. And we'll see that that's going to be a kind of a secondary function of the respiratory system is the production of speech sounds. And the paranasal sinuses are just one of a few structures that are going to function in the production of speech sounds in the respiratory system. Next, we have the hard palate, which is a bony structure that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. This is an important structure in humans because it allows us to chew our food in the oral cavity while still breathing at the same time, because it physically separates the oral and the nasal cavities. So while we are chewing and processing our food within the mouth with the teeth and the tongue, we can continue to breathe through our nose and through our nostrils. The soft palate is a structure that makes up the posterior part of the palate. That is, if you think of the palate as the roof of the mouth or the floor of the nasal cavity, because the palate is simply separating the oral and the nasal cavities. The hard palate makes up kind of the anterior part of the palate. Meanwhile, the soft palate makes up the posterior part of it. And the soft palate is a mostly muscular structure, mostly made out of skeletal muscle, that contains a structure called the uvula, and the soft palate and the uvula function to close the nasal cavity when we are swallowing, so that food makes its way down towards the esophagus instead of back up towards the nasal cavity or the posterior part of the nasal cavity. I mentioned the uvula already. It's a small teardrop-shaped piece of soft tissue that's mostly made out of skeletal muscle, and it, like the soft palate, functions to close the nasal cavity when we swallow. Next, we'll have the pharynx, and the pharynx is a passageway between the nasal cavity and the throat that contains three regions, which we'll see in a moment. The pharynx is mostly a muscular structure, and it is a lot like the soft palate in that it is primarily composed of skeletal muscle, and it is located between the nasal cavity. So the posterior part of the nasal cavity is where the pharynx begins, and the pharynx continues all the way to the back of the throat. And the three regions that we're going to see with the pharynx are the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is the superiormost region of the pharynx that is just posterior to the nasal cavity, and it is a passageway only for air. The oropharynx, as its name implies, is a region of the pharynx that's just posterior to the oral cavity. And this, the oropharynx, because of its position between the nose and the mouth, serves as a passageway for both air and food. So the oropharynx is essentially serving a dual role with both the respiratory and digestive systems. We see the same thing for the laryngopharynx, which is the inferiormost region of the pharynx that functions as a passageway for air and food. And it's here that air and food are essentially sorted. So food will, as we're swallowing and processing food, will be directed down into the esophagus. But if it's air that's moving through the laryngopharynx, that air is going to be directed into the larynx and then the trachea after that, so that it can go down into the lungs, or move in reverse and come up from the lungs. So we'll see those. One structure that I'll point out before we leave the discussion of the pharynx is this structure called the pharyngotympanic tube, which is also referred to as the auditory tube. The auditory tube functions to connect the nasopharynx to the chambers that are in the middle ear, and the pharyngotympanic or the auditory tube functions to help equalize the pressure between the nasopharynx and the middle ear. Next, we'll proceed down to the larynx, and the larynx is a structure that is quite a bit different than the pharynx, because the larynx changes tissue type. The larynx is a structure that's mostly composed of rings of hyaline cartilage, and the larynx functions to connect the pharynx to the trachea. And the reason that the larynx is a cartilaginous structure is so that the larynx can remain open as well as resist collapsing during the pressure changes that occur during breathing. So when we start to discuss some of the physiology of breathing, one of the major components in the physiology of breathing are the changes in pressure that occur in the thoracic cavity as well as in the pharynx and the larynx and the trachea during those breathing movements, during inhalation and exhalation. And so it's important to have a structure that's going to physically be able to stand up to those pressure changes and not collapse under those changes in pressure that are experienced during the normal breathing cycle. And so the larynx is just one of those structures. We'll see another one, which is the trachea and the bronchi. Both of those are cartilaginous structures that are composed of cartilage simply to resist the changes in pressure that are experienced during the breathing cycles. So there's a couple of different pieces of cartilage that compose the larynx, which we'll look at now. The thyroid cartilage is the most prominent piece of cartilage that makes up the larynx, and it contains a structure that's called the laryngeal prominence, which is a kind of anterior extension, an anterior enlargement, if you will, of the thyroid cartilage that's usually larger in males than it is in females, and often this structure is referred to as the Adam's apple. And the reason why it's typically larger in males than it is in females is because one of the stimuli for cartilage growth is testosterone. And because males are producing more testosterone on average than females are, that usually causes the laryngeal prominence to grow larger in males than it does in females. The next structure that we'll take a look at in the larynx is the cricoid cartilage, and this is a ring of cartilage that's the inferior-most ring of cartilage in the larynx, and it functions to connect the larynx to the trachea. There's also a couple of smaller pieces of cartilage that are within the larynx. These are collectively referred to as the the arytenoid cartilage, the corniculate cartilage, and the cuneiform cartilage. The arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform cartilage all function to attach to the epiglottis as well as the vocal folds, and they are involved in helping to move and support the vocal folds as air passes over them so that the vocal folds can produce speech sounds. So you'll see that the arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform cartilages have overall the same functions. Next we have the epiglottis, which is actually a structure that is situated between the laryngopharynx and the larynx. And the epiglottis is a piece of elastic cartilage that functions to close the trachea and close the larynx when we are swallowing. So what happens when we swallow is that the muscles in the throat essentially elevate the larynx. And when the larynx is elevated, it essentially causes the epiglottis to be pushed down over the top of the larynx to prevent food or beverages, drinks that we are consuming, prevents those from going down into the larynx and into the trachea. And instead, the epiglottis helps to direct those items that we've ingested posteriorly into the esophagus so that they can make their way down to the stomach. Within the larynx, we have a set of folds that are called the vocal folds, and these are white membranous pieces of connective tissue that are found in a region that's called the glottis. So there's specifically a chamber within the larynx that's referred to as the glottis, and the vocal folds are part of that glottis. And the vocal folds, as their name implies, are the folds of connective tissue that produce speech sounds as air passes over them. We have another set of folds that is above the vocal folds that are called the vestibular folds. So the vestibular folds are actually closer to the epiglottis than the vocal folds are. And the vestibular folds are membranes that simply help to close the larynx when we are swallowing. So they essentially kind of assist the epiglottis's function. And the glottis is defined as a region of the larynx that is essentially situated between the epiglottis and the vocal and vestibular folds. The glottis is essentially a passageway that contains the vocal folds, the vestibular folds, and the space in the middle of them, so that air can pass into and out of them during the breathing cycle. Next, moving inferiorly, we have the trachea, which is a flexible tube that's composed of roughly 16 to 20 C-shaped rings of cartilage. And that cartilage, just like with the larynx, is hyaline cartilage. And the trachea's function, a lot like the larynx is to provide a tough, rigid structure that is going to resist the pressure changes that the air passageways experience during breathing cycles. And so when we use the term a patent airway, the term patent means that it's not going to collapse under those pressure changes with the breathing cycles. The inferiormost piece of cartilage in the trachea is called the carina, and the carina represents the end of the trachea, and at the carina is where the trachea branches into a right and a left bronchi, and the right and the left bronchi that emerge from the carina enter the right and left lungs, respectively. The carina is also a very sensitive structure in that it contains a number of nerves that help to trigger coughing if any kind of dust or debris makes contact with it. So that way, any material that gets down to the bottom of the trachea can be expelled by coughing before it has a chance to enter the lungs and cause blockages or create infections or things like that. So at the carina is where the trachea branches into a right and a left primary or main bronchi. So the primary bronchi, which are also known as the main bronchi, are the first branches of the bronchi that serve to enter the right and the left lungs. So these are the main air passageways that are delivering air to and from, or serving as passageways to and from each of the lungs. Very shortly after that, the primary bronchi branch into secondary bronchi, and these are much smaller diameter bronchi. These are also referred to as the lobar bronchi, because the lobar or the secondary bronchi function as air passageways that serve each of the lobes of the lungs. So the right lung has 3 lobes. It has a superior, middle, and inferior lobe, and the left lung has 2 lobes, because the left lung is a little bit smaller, because if you recall, the position of the heart is slightly to the left, because the heart is kind of slightly tilted towards the left. And so a lot of the left ventricle and left atrium take up space that would otherwise be occupied by the left lung. And so for that reason, the left lung is a little bit smaller. It has 1 less lobe than the right lung does. But the lobar bronchi are the branches off of the primary, the main bronchi that serve each of those lung lobes. And then from there, the secondary bronchi branch a third time into what are called the tertiary bronchi. So the term tertiary just means third branch, right? And these are the branches of the bronchi that give rise to the thousands of bronchioles, which are the smaller microscopic air passageways that are going to serve individual parts of each of the lungs there. The terminal bronchioles are small air passageways that deliver air to and from structures that are called the respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles are starting to get to the point in the lungs where gas exchange takes place. So essentially the respiratory bronchioles are helping to move air to and from the actual gas exchange structures in the lungs. Because the primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi and the terminal bronchioles, they're not involved with gas exchange at all. That is, there's no oxygen or carbon dioxide moving between the air in them and the blood that is nearby. Their function, their job is simply to get air into and out of the lungs and into and out of those respiratory exchange surfaces that we're going to see in a moment. So there are roughly 1,000 terminal bronchioles per lung, and those terminal bronchioles branch into even finer, even smaller microscopic respiratory bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles are the smallest type of structure, air passageway, that we call a bronchiole, that serves to conduct air to and from structures that are called the alveolar ducts. And the alveolar ducts are air passageways that conduct air to and from the alveoli. And it's in those alveoli that we actually see the gas exchange surfaces and the gas exchange taking place with the blood. So we'll examine that in a moment as we get to it. Another term here as we get to the microscopic gas exchange structures in the lungs are the alveolar sacs. And an alveolar sac is simply a cluster of alveoli. And it's those alveoli, which are these microscopic little air chambers, air sacs, that function as the site of gas exchange. The alveoli themselves are composed of a very thin epithelial tissue, so they're a very thin, simple squamous epithelium. There's some elastic connective tissue in them as well. And the surface of the alveoli is covered with, almost entirely covered with capillaries. And it's the capillaries that are functioning to, along with the air that's in the alveoli, to exchange gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. There's millions of alveoli per lung, approximately 150 million per lung. So these are extremely small, extremely microscopic structures that have a huge surface area. And so that huge surface area is really, really important for the physiology of gas exchange, because physiology really likes things, if it's a surface that an exchange is taking place, the body usually has a very high surface area in structures that are performing exchange between the blood and other things. We'll see kind of a roughly similar arrangement in the kidneys as well, with the way that the kidneys process and filter, or initially filter, I should say, the blood to begin processing it and cleansing it. But yeah, high surface area is really important for gas exchange, and so that's why we see hundreds of millions of alveoli per lung, is because it simply increases the surface area and increases our efficiency at getting gases exchanged with the bloodstream. We also have alveolar pores, which are basically just small passageways that connect adjacent alveoli, which helps to permit the equalization of air pressure within all of the those millions of alveoli in the lung. The alveoli are composed primarily of a cell type that's called the type 1 alveolar cell, and the type 1 alveolar cell is a simple squamous epithelium that simply functions as the scaffolding for making the walls of the alveoli. And the type 1 alveolar cells, because they are the scaffolding that essentially make up the walls of the alveoli, it makes sense that they're the most numerous of the alveolar cells. There's a less numerous cell type called the type 2 alveolar cell that don't really function in providing structure to the alveoli. Instead, what the type 2 alveolar cells is, they produce a detergent-like substance that's called surfactant. And surfactant is really important in the very microscopic alveoli because the inner walls of the alveoli are coated with a thin layer of water. And the water is important to help facilitate the gas exchange between the air that's in the alveoli and the nearby capillaries that are surrounding each of the alveoli. And the problem that our lungs and our alveoli encounter is that with structures that are that microscopic, that are that small, water has what's called surface tension, and that surface tension actually promotes the collapse of the alveoli. And so what the surfactant does is the surfactant actually helps to break and reduce the surface tension of the water that coats the inner walls of each of the alveoli. And it helps the alveoli stay inflated, but then it also helps them inflate more easily when we inhale. And so that layer of water in the alveoli is important, but the surface tension of that water is detrimental to our physiology in that it promotes alveolar collapse and doesn't allow us to easily fill our lungs with air. So the surfactant, the detergent-like substance that's produced by the type 2 alveolar cells, helps to overcome that surface tension of the water and helps the alveoli to more easily inflate when we inhale. So moving on from there, we have a structure called the respiratory membrane, which is composed of a couple of structures. It's composed of three structures primarily. The first is the type 1 alveolar cells that make up the kind of the main lining or the main support of the alveoli. The respiratory membrane also contains the endothelial cells that we see in the capillaries that surround the alveoli. And there's also a thin layer of essentially a protein glue that kind of holds the alveolar epithelium to the capillary endothelium, and that's called the basement membrane. And the basement membrane essentially helps to bind the type 1 alveolar cells to the capillaries that are surrounding each of the alveoli. And the respiratory membrane is actually where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged between the air and the alveoli and the bloodstream. So just kind of backing up, looking more superficially at the lungs themselves, because we kind of essentially went from the air passageways all the way down to the microscopic structures of gas exchange. We have the lungs, and the lungs are quite simply the paired pyramid-shaped organs that are connected to the trachea, as we saw by the right and left main or primary bronchi. And the lungs are what contain those millions of alveoli that function in gas exchange. The apex of the lung, the term apex just means like the tip or the point. If you think of the lungs as an upright pyramid-shaped structure, the apex is kind of the tip of the pyramid, the superior tip of the pyramid of each of the lungs. The hilum would be the inferior kind of wider base of each lung. In the left lung, we have an indentation that's called the cardiac notch, because the heart, especially the left ventricle and some of the left atrium, takes some space inside of the left side of the thoracic cavity. And so the cardiac notch is an indentation in the left lung where the heart, where the left atrium and some of the left ventricle rest. The lungs themselves, both the right and left, are surrounded by a double-walled membrane that has a thin layer of fluid in between them. And this membrane is called the pleural membrane. And this membrane is composed of essentially two layers. The first is called the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura is the membrane that rests directly on the superficial surface of each lung. And it essentially folds over in on itself, and it becomes a structure called the visceral pleura, which the visceral pleura rests on the inner walls of the thoracic cavity. And between the parietal and the visceral pleura is a very thin layer of fluid, a very thin layer of water. And that water, because of the surface tension that water has that we had just discussed when we talked about the alveoli, that surface tension of the water that exists between the parietal and visceral pleura essentially helps to glue the outer part of the lung to the thoracic cavity. And the reason why that's important is because when our thoracic cavity expands as we inhale, it's important that the lungs expand with the thoracic cavity so that they can fill with air. So that increase in volume helps to drive air, create a pressure change inside of the lungs that drives air, fresh air into the lungs. And it's important that the lungs are essentially always following what the thoracic cavity is doing in order for air to be adequately moved into and out of the lungs. So what we see is that when we inhale, the thoracic cavity expands, and because the lungs are essentially stuck to the inner part of the thoracic cavity by the fluid that's in the parietal membrane, that's in the pleural membrane, the lungs will always follow what the thoracic cavity is doing. And likewise, when the thoracic cavity compresses and decreases its volume as we exhale, that creates a pressure change that forces air out of the lungs. And that sets us up for another inhale. So that membrane, along with that very thin layer of fluid in them, is really important for helping the lungs to kind of follow what the thoracic cavity is doing and create those pressure changes that are then going to create airflow into and out of the lungs. And when we review our physiology lab list for the respiratory system, we'll kind of talk a little bit more in detail about how those pressure changes occur, how the movement of the thoracic cavity creates those pressure changes, and how that helps to drive air into or out of the lungs. And so the parietal and visceral pleura are important for keeping the lungs essentially attached and following the thoracic cavity. And so that's why if a lung is punctured or if a lung is damaged, and air gets into the space between the parietal and the visceral pleura, that's what promotes lung collapse, is because the lung is no longer able to follow what the thoracic cavity is doing because it doesn't have that thin layer of water that's helping to secure it to the inner part of the thoracic cavity. So when air gets in there from like a punctured lung, then that promotes lung collapse. So that wraps it up for our review of really most of the major anatomical structures and some of their basic functions for this particular module. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, there is a respiratory physiology lab list, and I have a video that highlights the major physiological concepts and some explanations in there. So please refer to that if you need any kind of further in-depth review of the major physiology functions of the respiratory system.